Hello, good morning, and welcome today for this August edition of Coffee Hour. My name is Ryan Anderson. I'm the outreach manager here at Kendal at Home. With me today from the Kendal at Home side, we have our CEO, Lynn Giacobbe, with us, and as well as Sue Woykin, who is our marketing and events coordinator. Sue will be kind of monitoring the behind the scenes, the chat, the Q&A, any technical things going on with this webinar. So if you have any questions or things like that, please feel free to direct them over to Sue there. Just a few little housekeeping items before we begin. And I introduce our guest here today. So up in the top right-hand corner, you can change the view if you so like. If you want to adjust things that way, feel free to go ahead there. Also, we have the transcript down at the bottom, the closed captioning. If you want to change it, edit it, turn it off, whatever. Down at the bottom, there's a live transcript CC button. Go ahead and click that, and the little caret in the top right-hand corner there, you can change the size of that if you want. You can adjust it, turn it off, whatever fits your preferences for this webinar. And then as well as there is the Q&A and the chat feature at the bottom. Feel free to type in any questions or comments you have along there, and we'll address those at the end. We'll make sure to save some time there for that if we have any questions afterwards. But without further ado, I want to introduce our guest this morning, Jeri Diehl-Cusack. Jeri is a retired librarian and a lifelong learner of presidential history and all things presidential history, taking a special interest in Eleanor Roosevelt and the Roosevelt administration. But today she's going to be talking a little bit more about presidential history through the month of August, taking us through. We got hundreds of years of history to it, and a lot of stuff going on. And Jeri, as we were talking about before, history is ever evolving all around us. We're living in history right now, so it's interesting to get that perspective too of people who were living these moments or whatever like that, where history, we might not have thought it was going to be history, but now it is, and we're learning about it today. So we're really excited to learning more about month of August throughout this presidential history. So.
Thank you, Ryan. Thank you. Yes, our country has been around since 1776. We've had a president since 1789. And so we're going to talk about some events that happened in the 1700s, 1800s, 1900s, and 2000s. But we're going to start on August 1st. Oh, I got to tell you about the book. You heard I was a librarian, and I've got the book right here with me. I heard about this interesting concept where Paul Brandis went through our entire history and chose several events that happened on every day of the year from January 1st through December 31st. But we're just talking about the things that happened during the month of August today. So we'll go from August 1st to August 31st. But I highly recommend this book. I'm sure you could find it at a public library, like where I used to work, or through lots of different bookstores. So Paul Brandis put this together in 2018. So let's start with August 1st. And our president on August 1st, 1946, was this man, Harry Truman. You probably recognize his picture. Harry Truman was our last president to serve in that office who never earned a college degree. Think about that. He was thrust into the presidency on April 12th of 1945. So he had been president for just a little over a year on August 1st of 1946, when he signed into law the Fulbright Scholarship Program, named for Arkansas Senator William J. Fulbright. And part of the reasoning that this bill passed and President Truman signed it was that he recognized that our world had changed post World War II, and that it was very important for us as Americans and for us as residents of the world to have as much education as we possibly could. So he actually had a quote in here. He says that without a strong educational system, democracy is crippled. He also said, knowledge is not only the key to power, it is the citadel of human freedom. So that's our August 1st entry. On to August 2nd, we're going to go back in time to 1923, when this man, one of the 8 presidents that the state of Ohio claims, and I'm here in Worthington, Ohio, a suburb of Columbus. The Kendal folks are up in Westlake, Ohio. This man was from Marion, Ohio. His name was Warren G. Harding. And sadly, he died in office, the 7th of our eight presidents who died in office. He died on August 2nd of 1923. He had been traveling cross country on his voyage of understanding, and maybe had a heart attack, maybe, had some food poisoning, but in any case, he passed away just 2 years and less than 5 months into his administration, one of our shorter serving presidents. Another thing that happened on August 2nd, but in 1939, concerned Franklin Roosevelt. I do know a little bit about him, but he received a letter warning him about a new phenomenon. The letter was from this man, Albert Einstein, who wanted Roosevelt to know that Nazi Germany was trying to harness the power of the atom and create a single bomb carried by a boat, which, if exploded in a port, might very well destroy the whole port together with some of the surrounding territory. So FDR suddenly realized if the Nazis over in Germany, this was before we entered World War II, but if they were working on this, maybe we should think about trying to achieve the same ability. And that started what was known as the Manhattan Project, the crash effort to build an atomic bomb during World War II. Okay, we talked about our president Harding dying on August 2nd out in California on August 2nd, 1923. So later that morning in the early hours in Plymouth Notch, Vermont, this man, the vice president, someone came to the door with a telegram to inform him and his father that President Harding had died and that he was now to become the president of the United States. So Calvin Coolidge was sworn into office up there in his parents' home. His mother was deceased, but his family home in Plymouth Notch, Vermont, by his father. His father was a notary public, so he had the ability to administer the oath of office to his son. First time, only time that's ever happened. And what did Calvin Coolidge do after being sworn into as president at like 2 a.m? He went back to bed, went back to sleep. And it's said that Calvin Coolidge, who served as our president from August 3rd of 1923 until he left office in March of 1929, actually presided over most of the roaring 20s here in our country. But it's said that he missed most of those roaring 20s because he routinely slept 10 to 11 hours a night and took long daily naps in the daytime as well. So Calvin Coolidge became president on August 3rd of 1923. On to August 4th, one of our presidential birthdays we'll celebrate as we go through the month of August. This was the birthday in 1961 of Barack Obama, our 44th president, born in Honolulu, Hawaii, and looks a little bit younger in this portrait than when we see him now. But happy belated birthday, President Obama. On to August 5th, when I have 3 things I want to share with you. The first of which occurred in 1861, when Abraham Lincoln was in the first year of his presidency. He actually signed the Revenue Act into law. It created the first federal income tax. And why did they need income? To fight the Civil War. They needed to be able to pay for the Civil War. So they set a certain income level at which someone's earnings would be taxed at 3%. And that income level was $800. If I'm doing my math correctly, I think they would pay $24 in income tax to help finance the Civil War back in 1861. Let's move on to 1965, when Lyndon Baines Johnson was our president. An important occurrence happened on August 5th because he signed the Voting Rights Act into law. The law guaranteed that African Americans would have the right to vote, and it made it illegal to impose restrictions on federal, state, and local elections that could deny that right. So big event. It took years to get that passed, but LBJ made that happen in 1965. And although Richard Nixon is smiling in this portrait of him, he probably was not smiling on August 5th of 1974. It was that day that Nixon reluctantly had to release tapes related to the Watergate break-in. One of them was known as the smoking gun tape, and it was from June 23rd of 1972. Once that smoking gun tape was made public, it basically doomed Nixon's presidency. And we'll talk about some more about that in just a few days here. Let's go on to August 6th of 1945. First, I want to mention a first lady who was born on August 6th and in 1861, and incredibly, she was still alive on August 6th of 1945. She was in her 80s, if I'm doing the math correctly, but Edith Roosevelt, the second wife of Theodore Roosevelt, celebrated her birthday that day. August 6th of 1945 is better known as the day that an atomic bomb was dropped on Hiroshima. There's a second picture of a bombing that would occur 3 days later at Nagasaki, but August 6th, 1945 is certainly a very impactful day in our history, not only American history, but the history of the world. And it was Harry Truman, who had just been president for less than 4 months, who had to make a decision about whether to drop the first bomb on Hiroshima and the second bomb a few days later in Nagasaki. And in his memoirs, Harry thought was right. He knew that there would be huge American and Japanese casualties if the United States invaded, if the Allies invaded mainland Japan. So he did what he thought was right. He had to make a huge and very momentous decision. And that's what happened on August 6th. So on to August 7th, 1990. And I feel badly that we're talking about war yet again, but on this date in 1990, President George H.W. Bush ordered Operation Desert Shield. It was the beginning of the US military buildup that culminated in Operation Desert Storm, which freed the country of Kuwait that had been invaded by Iraq back in 1990. On to August 8th, 1974, we just talked about Richard Nixon and the smoking gun tape. 3 days after the tape came out, he announced his resignation. He announced he would be resigning the following day. And what did he say about this? Nixon said, "I have never been a quitter. To leave office before my term is completed is abhorrent to every instinct in my body. But as president, I must put the interest of America first. America needs a full-time president and a full-time Congress, particularly at this time with the problems we face at home and abroad." And of course, we were still fighting in the Vietnam War at that time. So the following morning, Richard Nixon waved goodbye after officially resigning that day. And at noon on August 9th of 1974, we had a new president, a man who was born in Omaha, Nebraska, with the name of Leslie Lynch King Jr. But that's not the president we know. We know him as Gerald Rudolph Ford Jr., having been adopted by his mother's second husband, Gerald Ford. Jerry Ford took over as president of the United States on August 9th of 1974, our only president to never have been elected either vice president or president of the United States, but he stepped up to the job and took charge. So on August 10th of 1846, we're going back several years, 70 some years, I guess. We're talking about this president, not one of our most recognizable presidents, perhaps. This is James K. Polk of Tennessee. And on August 10th of 1846, the biggest series of museums was created when President Polk signed the Smithsonian Institution Act. The Smithsonian, tourists in Washington, D.C. are often surprised to learn, consists of not just one museum, but of 28 different museums, galleries, research facilities, and the National Zoo is part of the Smithsonian. The Smithsonian today contains, well, this was 4 years ago, contains more than 142 million artifacts and specimens. Who knows how many are in the collection 4 years later? That was August 10th of 1846. On to another event on August 10th in 1874, this president, Herbert Hoover, was born out in West Branch, Iowa. He was a one-term president. He was the president who got, was in office when the stock market crashed in October of 1929, and he lost his re-election bid in 1932 to Franklin Roosevelt. But happy belated birthday to you, Herbert Hoover. August 11th, 1984, Ronald Reagan was our president. Ronald Reagan was out at his ranch in California, and he was getting ready to do his weekly radio broadcast. And he made what he thought was a joke because he thought the microphone wasn't live. He forgot to test it. It was live. And it wasn't broadcasting to the public yet, but he did say that day, as he was trying to make a joke, he got on the radio and he said, "My fellow Americans," he's the great communicator. He said, "I'm pleased to tell you today that I've signed legislation that will outlaw Russia forever. We will begin bombing in 5 minutes." But the microphone was on and he was being recorded. The recording was later leaked to the public. A Japanese newspaper reported that the Soviet Union placed some of its forces on heightened alert. And a Soviet news agency actually said the USSR condemns this unprecedented and hostile attack by the US president. And the Soviets also said this kind of behavior is incompatible with the great responsibility borne by heads of nuclear states for the destinies of their own people and mankind. Thankfully, that all kind of managed to be taken care of without any further incident on August 11th of 1984. So now we're up to August 12th. Today's August 12th. But back, what would that be? 124 years ago in 1898, this president, also one of our Ohio presidents, William McKinley, was signing the treaty. He was actually looking on as the United States and the country of Spain signed a protocol ending the Spanish-American War. And just a little Spanish-American War lesson, Spain agreed to grant Cuba its independence and to cede Puerto Rico and Guam to the United States. That's how they became territories of ours. The fate of the Philippines, the site of a big US victory in the Spanish-American War, would be determined at a later date. But they signed a pact to end that war on this date in 1898, 124 years ago. On to August 13th. Now we're talking about 1961, the first year in the presidency of John Fitzgerald Kennedy. And at that time, JFK was criticizing the construction of the Berlin Wall that tried to prevent people from fleeing communist East Germany to go into the free West German part of that country. It says the communist guards, troops guarded that wall around the clock, and for the next 28 years shot at anyone trying to escape. Some 5,000 people did try to escape, and an estimated 600 of them were killed trying to get out. What did JFK say about the Berlin Wall? Here's a quote and a picture of the wall with a lot of graffiti on it. JFK said the wall is a heck of a lot better than a war. So in some ways, maybe the wall prevented another major conflict in our world. On to August 14th, and we're going to talk about things that happened in two different years. 1935 first, when that was the day that FDR signed the Social Security Act into law. It was initially created to provide guaranteed income for unemployed and retired Americans. It was later expanded to include the disabled. When the president launched Social Security in 1935, we were in the midst of the Great Depression, which certainly affected my grandparents and my parents as children. But the poverty rate for senior citizens back in 1935 was estimated to be over 50%. So yes, some of you might be very familiar, almost all of us, I would guess, we're very familiar with Social Security that was signed into law in 1935. In 1945, 10 years later, the war with Japan was brought to an end. Now this photo is actually where they're signing the peace agreement that didn't occur until September. But on August 14th of 1945, President Truman announced the unconditional surrender of Japan, bringing World War II to an end. Let's go on to August 15th of 1914. Well, first of all, I want to say happy birthday on August 15th to Florence Harding, the wife of Warren G. Harding. Also, Florence was an Ohio First Lady, born in 1860. But on August 15th of 1914, former President Teddy Roosevelt, who had served from September of 1901 when he ascended to the presidency upon the assassination of William McKinley, and then served until March of 1909 when William Howard Taft, another Ohio president, took office. But in 1914, which would have been in the second year of Woodrow Wilson's administration, Teddy Roosevelt did live to see the opening of the Panama Canal, which fulfilled his vision for a way to travel between the Caribbean and the Atlantic over into the Pacific Ocean. Teddy Roosevelt had the vision. It took several years past his time as president, but he did live long enough to see the Panama Canal opened on this date, August 15th of 1914. August 16th of 1841 was a very bad day for this president, another president that may not be so recognizable. His name was John Tyler, and he had become our first president to ascend to the presidency when William Henry Harrison died in office just 1 month into his term, which began on March 4th, 1841, and ended on April 4th of 1841. So 4.5 months later, in August of 1841, John Tyler was being burned in effigy at the White House by members of his own political party, the Whigs. as in WHIGS. He was a states' rights president. He was never quite in sync with even his own party, and a mob believed to consist of angry Whigs marched to the White House, where they threw rocks, fired guns, and hanged the president in effigy before they burned him in effigy. A very bad day in the one 4-year term minus a month presidency of John Tyler of Virginia. On to August 17th, 1998, more recently, but also a very bad day for President Bill Clinton. On that day in 1998, Bill Clinton became the first sitting president to testify as the subject of a grand jury investigation related to his relationship with a woman named Monica Lewinsky. I think we all pretty well remember that situation 24 years ago. Let's go back, way back to 1795, when our first president, George Washington, was also involved in a treaty to prevent a war. But first, see that asterisk at the bottom there on the left, August 18th, so next week, that must be next Thursday, will be Rosalind Carter's 95th birthday. She and her husband, Jimmy, I believe, have been married 76 years, and she will be 95 next week. So we hope that she stays well and enjoys her birthday. They are the longest ever married presidential couple. They've both lived well into their 90s, and we wish them well, particularly Rosalind on her birthday next week. But let's go back to 1795. On August 18th, that's when George Washington signed what was known as the Jay Treaty with Britain, possibly preventing another war because there was some interference with American trade with France, and George Washington was not ready to fight the British and again. So a treaty was signed that day. On to August 19th. Two things I want to tell you about. First, in 1946, one of our presidents was born, and he was born with the initials W.J., the last name Blythe, and he was actually the third W.J. Blythe. But his father had died a couple of months before he was born in a car accident. So this baby bracelet that I took a picture of when I was visiting Little Rock, Arkansas, belonged to William Jefferson Blythe III, that we now know with his stepfather's last name, William Jefferson Clinton. So next week, a week from today, Bill Clinton will be celebrating his 76th birthday. Happy birthday, President Clinton. And in 1974, I told you we had a new president who took office on August 9th of 1974. So 10 days later, our new president, Gerald Ford, was able to select his vice president that he wanted to serve with him. And he chose this man that you might recognize as Nelson Rockefeller of the state of New York, who became Gerald Ford's vice president for the remainder of that term of office. August 20th, 1833, guess what? We have another Ohio president celebrating a birthday. And this man, again, some of you may recognize him, some of you will not, but you will know who he is, perhaps if I tell you that he is the only president to have been the grandson of another president. This man's name is Benjamin Harrison, grandson of William Henry Harrison. Benjamin did, however, get to serve a full 4-year term of office let's see, he would have gone into office in March of 1885, I believe. No, 1889, and then he served until 1893. He was the president who was elected between the terms of Grover Cleveland. Benjamin Harrison won the Electoral College, but not the popular vote, but became president. So he chopped up the terms of Grover Cleveland, who served as president so far as the only president to serve 2 non-consecutive terms. And what else happened while Benjamin Harrison and his wife were living in the White House? They actually wired the building for electricity. But it just seemed a little too scary to walk over and flip that switch on or off to the Harrisons. So they usually found a staff person, either one of their political aides or one of the workers there in the White House, that would turn the switch and turn the lights off and on, just to be safe. They didn't touch those things. On to August 21st of 1959. And our president at that time was Dwight Eisenhower. You probably all recognize him. We're getting a little closer to current days. Dwight Eisenhower signed a bill on August 21st of 1959, making Hawaii the 50th state in our union. It had been annexed by the United States in 1898 after the Spanish-American War. But it was considered vital to our national security. And we saw how that played out, during World War II. Pearl Harbor in the territory of Hawaii was bombed and became an important station out there in the Pacific Ocean. But yes, Democrats at the time in 1959 were a little concerned about letting Hawaii into the United States because it had a predominantly non-white population. That's hard to fathom now at this time, perhaps. But that happened back in 1959 on August 21st. August 22nd was the only day of the entire month of August that we are celebrating a presidential wedding anniversary. It was the anniversary of yet another Ohio president. You'll recognize Ulysses S. Grant, I expect. And here is his lovely bride, Julia Dent Grant. They were married, I believe, about 36 years before Ulysses S. Grant's untimely death of throat cancer, which I believe was in 1885. Okay, August 23rd, 1940, as we move into our latter part of August, was the anniversary of FDR signing 2 bills into law to protect investors and to restore confidence in the economy. We're still coming out of the Great Depression. World War II has not yet created the situation at Pearl Harbor that finally involved the United States directly. So we're still trying to remain neutral, trying to help Great Britain perhaps, but we're also trying to protect our own economy. So FDR signed these 2 bills, the Investment Company Act and the Investment Advisors Act, into law back 82 years ago on August 23rd. August 24th was a very dark day in our American history. It was during the War of 1812, but it was August 24th of 1814 when the British marched on Washington, D.C. and burned down both our Capitol building and the White House. Only the exterior stone shell of the White House remained. Everything else had to be rebuilt. And President James Madison and his wife Dolly had to flee the White House that day. Dolly Madison famously had the Gilbert Stuart portrait of George Washington basically ripped out of its frame there in the White House and rolled up and carried to safety by one of the people working for her in the White House. Her husband was away closer to the the battlefront and came back to an empty White House. And he fled, and they would never again live in that building because it was burnt to the ground. The British did do one interesting thing. When they got to the building, the White House, which was then called the President's House, I must admit, they noticed that there was food on the dining room table. The Madisons had left so quickly, they didn't eat their dinner. So the British came in and ate dinner before they burned down our White House, but a very dark day in our American history. On to August 25th of 1950, and we're back to Harry Truman. Some dates had more events to choose from than others, but this is the one I chose to tell you about from 1950 on August 25th. Harry Truman had to basically order the army to take control of the railroads because he thought it was essential to our national defense to allow the railroads to supply, to move troops and materiel to for the war that was taking place over in the country of Korea. August 26th of 1987 was the day that President Reagan, Ronald Reagan, decided that we would have 911 become our emergency number day. The president urged Americans to remember the number 911. We all know that now, which he said would save numerous lives in times of emergency. And it would take effect on September 11th of 1987. September 11th, 2001 became another whole event, but that's September. We're still in August, and we're moving right along here to August 27th of 1908, the birthday of Lyndon Baines Johnson. He was born out in Stonewall, Texas, and yes, as Ryan and I have discussed, I got to drive by his ranch, his family ranch in 1964, the first summer that he was president of the United States. He was born right on that same ranch, Stonewall, Texas. He was our 36th president. And of course, sadly, he became president upon the assassination of JFK in Dallas, Texas in November of 1963. But his years were very momentous. We talked about him signing the Voting Rights Act in 1965, and his whole agenda was called the Great Society. But his domestic achievements were offset by the Vietnam War. And yes, by 1968, he took office, as I said, in November of 63. He was elected in his own right, along with Hubert Humphrey. In 1964, their term of office started in 1965, but in 1968, he had decided that he would not run for re-election. And very interesting to me is that he died just 4 days after the next term of office that was won by Richard Nixon would have ended. Had he run again, had he been elected another 4-year term, who knows whether he would have made it. He had had several heart attacks, and he died of a heart attack just 4 days after Nixon's first term ended. So just a little bit of trivia to add to our story today. I got to tell you about LBJ and his comments about the presidency. You know, he said that being president is just like being a jackass in a hailstorm. You just have to stand there and take it. There's nothing else to do. You just have to, just endure. Let me get a sip of water and we'll go on to the next date. Okay, now I've got 2 stories to tell you for August 28th. Of 1917 and 2005. But yes, one more birthday. And guess what? It's another Ohioan. Lucy Hayes, wife of Rutherford B. Hayes, was born in 1831 in Chillicothe, Ohio. So Happy almost birthday to Lucy Hayes. But back to 1917, when this president, you'll probably recognize Woodrow Wilson, who had 3 daughters, was very much opposed to women's suffrage in 1917. And one day, leaving the White House, Wilson was hounded by women suffragists demanding the right to vote. 10 of those women were arrested and thrown in jail, where they went on hunger strikes and were force-fed. The resulting publicity upset the president very much, and maybe his daughters might have had a little word with dad as well. But he finally agreed to back the 19th Amendment, and it took until August of 1920 for that amendment, women's suffrage, to be officially passed by enough states to give women the right to vote. 102 years ago, they finally got to the right to vote, but it took those women to upset Woodrow Wilson back in 1917 to start moving things along. In 2005, George W. Bush was our president, and we're on August 18th. It was on that date that Hurricane Katrina devastated New Orleans and the Gulf Coast. We have had terrible weather, terrible things, lately, all kinds of fires and floods and storms and tornadoes. But Hurricane Katrina was kind of one of the largest natural disasters in American history. Killed at least 1,245 people, it says, and in 2017 dollars, it cost $130 billion in damages. And George W. Bush was the president at the time and took some heat for how that was handled. There are a lot of storms coming, apparently, with our weather today, unfortunately. August 29th, let's keep moving. We're almost to the end of our time to discuss this, but almost to the end of the month as well. So in 1862, a major battle was being fought at the Battle of Bull Run, which I believe was also known as the Battle of Manassas. But the Confederates scored a major victory at this second battle in the same location. Sorry, we got a trash truck going by. I hope you can still hear me. The problem was on August 29th of 1862, it was early in the Civil War, and President Lincoln was alerted that the capital city was exposed to extreme danger, and possibly he himself might be personally in danger. But for whatever reason, the Confederate General Robert E. Lee, that we know was a West Point grad and the head general of the Confederate forces, decided not to continue on into Washington, D.C. He did not cross the Potomac and head to the capital city of the Union forces. He instead turned to the Maryland town of Sharpsburg. He marched his troops more north into Maryland than east into Washington, D.C., and the Titanic Battle of Antietam would occur in just 3 weeks or so afterwards, at which the Confederates suffered a major loss. So there could have been a completely different outcome, perhaps, had General Lee marched on Washington, D.C. back on August 29th of 1862. August 30th of 1963, JFK decided at that time that he needed to establish a direct phone line, which would be called a hotline, to the Kremlin in Moscow in 1963. Why did he decide this needed to be done? Because during the 1962 Cuban Missile Crisis, which occurred in October of the previous year, a nuclear war between the Soviet Union and the United States was barely averted. And the President Kennedy, was frustrated that he could not communicate more quickly and quickly enough with Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev at the time. Each side, the Russians and the Americans, used encrypted messages that had to be relayed by telegraph or radio between the Kremlin and the Pentagon. Kennedy feared that such a cumbersome system might lead to misunderstandings or delays in communicating during a future crisis. So this hotline would allow the president to call the Pentagon with a message which could be immediately typed into a teletype machine and fed into a transmitter. The message could reach the Kremlin within minutes as opposed to hours. And in 1963, so almost 60 years ago, it was regarded as a communication marvel. Communications have changed dramatically in the last 59 years, but JFK knew they needed to be able to talk quicker and more accurately. So we're on to the last day of the month, August 31st. We've come all the way through our history. We're now in the year 1935. There wasn't a lot to choose from in the book for August 31st, but we're back to my buddy FDR and his little dog, Fala, his little Scottish Terrier, who was his constant companion, particularly because FDR was paralyzed and was not able to move and to do certain things that most of our presidents have been able to do. But FDR signed a Neutrality Act on August 31st of 1935. It would ban the shipment of arms to belligerents during a state of war. The act was clearly aimed at two countries in Europe back in 1935, those countries being Adolf Hitler's Germany and Benito Mussolini's Italy. So I'm glad to end the month with an act of neutrality after all the other sad wartime events that we've discussed during the month of August. But we made it to the end of the month. I'm right about on my time frame. Ryan, I thank you so much for giving me this opportunity to share some history from the month of August with all of your Kendal at Home coffee hour folks. And I certainly appreciate your support of the work that I do, and also the work that I do to raise money for my Walk to End Alzheimer's team. If I may take 1 minute, I'd like to share that both of my parents had dementia at the end of their lives. In fact, it was 41 years ago in 1981 when my then 58-year-old mother was diagnosed with premature senility. We would probably call it early onset dementia or early onset Alzheimer's today. She lived until 1998, almost 18 years with this. And 8 years after my mother passed away in 1998, my dad was diagnosed by a neurologist with Alzheimer's, but he was 83 years old at the time. And his journey, his Alzheimer's journey, was only about 4 years. So I use my love of presidential history and my librarian skills to do research and to find wonderful books to put together programs that I love to share with audiences all over the state of Ohio. And now I can share them by Zoom with folks from other parts of our country. So thank you for your interest in my work. Thank you for allowing me to use my personal anti-Alzheimer's therapy to share this story with you today. Any questions, any comments? I'd love to take them now.
Absolutely. And yeah, anyone, if you have any questions, comments, please feel free to throw them into the Q&A or chat there. Jeri, as you talked about with me before on it, you're using the history and the knowledge and everything to keep your mind fresh. As you said, your anti-Alzheimer's skills there on it. Yeah, and thank you for bringing that up too with the Alzheimer's Association. So Kendal at Home will be sending a donation to your walk on that for your participation here today, and Kendal at Home will also be walking in the Cleveland Walk here. I believe it's on September 17th, Saturday, September 17th. Kendal at Home members, please be on the lookout for that. You'll be receiving something here in the coming weeks on more information on that coming up. But Jeri, thank you so much for talking about all this information here. I mean, I lived in DC for a little bit. One that stuck out to me was Polk with the Smithsonian, signing that in. I had no clue that was Polk's work there on it. I mean, if you go through the National Mall in DC and see all the Smithsonian museums, every single museum there's a Smithsonian insert name after, National Gallery or archives, the natural history. And so it's very cool to get that understanding. I'd never known that. I've gone to those museums,
and they're all
many
free.
times.
They're
And they're all
free.
free.
Because of the benefactor James Smithson, an Englishman who left his money to create this wonderful institution in the United States. So the Smithsonian just celebrated their 176th birthday, this week. I received emails from them. So again, yes, on that date, I think it was the 11th of August, but they just were very happily celebrating. So.
Yeah, no, absolutely. It's a fantastic thing to see in person, as you mentioned too, all free. A very cool experience to really pass on lifelong learning and really help educate people on history things too. And I thought it was interesting too. August 6th, it was with Hiroshima and Truman's response to it of, I did what I felt like I needed to do, which I cannot imagine being in that position. I know I spoke to my great uncle, who I was very close to. He was on the boat to Japan, going to be in deployment when the bombs were dropped.
Thinking he was going to invade, you're saying.
And so I had to ask him, I go, what do you feel? How do you feel about that? He goes, and he gave a very similar response to it. But his response was, it was going to be very tough to win. So it was an interesting kind of perspective from people who were living in the moment, actively engaged in it, versus nowadays most times it's a tough topic to think about, to have to make those decisions. But as you mentioned too, lots of talk on war here, so good to end on a high note there on the 31st. But just interesting in walking through history, seeing how things play out. Social Security being implemented, the Bull Run and Antietam later on, major events that have major things. But Bull Run, the Confederacy is winning. Who knows? Who knows if they march on Washington, and it could be entirely different from history. And you can only imagine what's going through Lincoln's mind in that moment. They're not knowing what the outcome will be. It worked out in the end, but it's just crazy how history plays itself out. A question that I have for you on it: what do you see as kind of the most influential bit of history that happened in August? It could have been a major turning point. It could have been an act. It could have been a historical event. What do you what event kind of singled out in your mind on this?
Well, in my lifetime, I remember, well, and this is another sort of personal thing, and maybe this isn't the answer you're looking for, but I spent my last quarter of my bachelor's program at Ohio State over in France. I was over in the summer of 1974. I was going to graduate in August, at the end of August of 1974, and I'm over there, and I had an opportunity perhaps to come back and be an au pair, like a governess for a French family. So I wasn't sure I was going to even be in the United States for my college graduation that summer. But turns out our commencement speaker at OSU the summer of 1974 was scheduled to be Vice President Gerald Ford. By the time I graduated at the end of August of 1974, and I was back in the United States, and I did go because guess who was our commencement speaker? Not the Vice President of the United States, but the President of the United States spoke at my college graduation. So that was kind of a thrill.
That
Kind of
has to
an
be pretty memorable,
unexpected.
I believe. But most people, when they talk about commencement addresses, it's, oh, I don't really remember who spoke, or I don't remember what they talked about. I was there or whatever. I feel like that one has to be a little pretty memorable.
Well, it just kind of feels like it was meant to be, it was meant to encourage I had a bachelor's degree in French. I ended up starting library school up at Case Western in Cleveland about a year or so after I graduated from OSU. But, all of this has led me kind of full circle back to my lifelong interest in presidents and first ladies. So that was just what came to mind initially. That's probably not at all the answer you expected.
Oh no, and it might be the same one here on it. Someone had asked, and I know you do August and February are your main 2 months that you kind of
August and April.
It's April. Okay. Yep. What do you have a favorite presidential or favorite day in presidential history of any month, any day? Is there something that sticks out?
If I had to give you a favorite day, it would not be a presidential date. It would be a first lady date. It would be October 11th. I happened to join the staff of the Grandview Heights Public Library here in Columbus on October 11th of 1984, when I was retiring from Grandview. I'd worked at the Cuyahoga County Public Library in Brooklyn and Parma, and also downtown at the main library here in Columbus before I started at Grandview. But when I was retiring in October of 2009, I kind of realized October 11th, 1884 was Eleanor Roosevelt's birthday. I joined the Grandview Library staff on October 11th, 1984. I was retiring in October of 2009. And so I said to my husband, I really would like to go to Hyde Park, New York, as kind of, every president and some first ladies, Eleanor being at least one first lady, the National Park Service does, and the military do a ceremony on the president's birthday at their grave site for those presidents who are deceased. And they, have wreaths that are laid and music and maybe a little short speech by a local congressman or member of Congress or whatever. So anyway, I ended up being able to go to Eleanor Roosevelt's 125th birthday celebration in Hyde Park, New York. And I met some women who were involved in an organization who within a year or so invited me to get involved in their organization, even though I lived 10 hours away, in Ohio. I'm not in Hyde Park. But on Eleanor Roosevelt's 128th birthday in October 11th of 2012, I got to lay a wreath on her grave. I got to walk on that hallowed ground where FDR and Eleanor Roosevelt are buried in the rose garden of Sarah Delano Roosevelt's home, Springwood, in Hyde Park, New York, and be the official representative of this organization to put a wreath at her grave. So October 11th happens to be a very fond day that I, just somehow that seemed to mesh together, that my work as a librarian and my interest in the Roosevelts just, completely clicked as well.
It's funny, you were talking before on different things where even like quotes from Eleanor Roosevelt you were using in different applications and things before even there. So it's funny how you have this now where even career-wise, just dates just lined up in a special way.
The stars aligned perfectly.
Absolutely.
And sort of just getting to know the folks at Kendal at Home and having this second opportunity to share with you, it's just felt like a true pleasure and a true honor. Thank you so much.
Absolutely. And thank you, Jeri. I'm not seeing any other questions. If there's any other questions, Jeri has her email right there. I'm sure she'd be more than happy to answer any questions people have on history topics or anything there. But Jeri, thank you so much for joining us today. on it. Fantastic presentation on history. And thank you all for joining us today on this program. We have upcoming events as well, so be on the lookout for those coming up. As always, we do thank the Friends Foundation for the Aging for their generous support in helping us put on these events for Kendal at Home members and the general public as well, in allowing us to support our programming efforts. And so we look forward to coming out with some more events here coming up, and so be on the lookout there. So thank you, Jeri, and thank you all for joining us.
Thanks, everybody. Thank you, Ryan.